Lenora Whitlock dropped the wooden spoon the moment the carriage wheels crunched against the gravel outside. Her hands were covered in flour, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and the kitchen behind her was thick with the smell of burnt bread. She had exactly 4 minutes before the Duke of Marrowfield stepped through that door, and not a single dish on the table was finished. She wiped her palms against her apron and ran to the window, peering through the curtain just as a tall figure stepped down from the carriage. He stood taller than she expected, his coat dark and plain, his face unreadable from this distance. Word in the village said he was searching for a wife who could manage his estate kitchen herself. No servants, no shortcuts. A woman who could feed a household with her own 2 hands. Lenora had claimed in her letter that she was exactly that woman. She was not. She grabbed the nearest pot, shoved the burnt bread under a cloth, and prayed the stew had not turned. Footsteps echoed against the front steps. A firm knock followed, 3 times, slow and deliberate. She smoothed her hair, took one breath, and opened the door to find him already staring past her shoulder, his eyes narrowing at the smoke curling from her kitchen. "Tell me, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city or country below. I read every single one, and here is what I am curious about. Do you think a woman who lies her way into a duke's house deserves a second chance to prove herself? Leave your answer in the comments. I will be replying to as many as I can. If you want to see whether Lenora's secret survives the dinner table, press subscribe before we continue." Lenora Whitlock stood frozen in the doorway as the Duke of Marrowfield stepped past her without a single word of greeting. He walked straight into the kitchen, his boots loud against the stone floor, and stopped in front of the table where 4 dishes sat under clothes she had thrown over them in a panic. He lifted one cloth himself. The bread underneath was black at the edges and sunken in the middle. He did not flinch. He simply looked at it, then looked at her, and his jaw tightened in a way that told her everything she needed to know about how this evening would go. He was not a soft man. His shoulders were broad, and his coat fit him like armor rather than fashion. His eyes were deep gray, sharp and unblinking, the kind of eyes that measured a person and rarely found them worth keeping. He had inherited the Marrowfield estate 3 years earlier, after his father's sudden passing, and since then he had run it the way a general runs a campaign, with discipline, with order, and with absolutely no patience for failure. "You wrote in your letter that you could feed a household of 20 without help," he said, his voice flat and cold. This bread could not feed a single sparrow. Lenora's throat tightened. She had written that letter out of desperation, not deceit, though she knew the difference would not matter to him. Her family's small holding near the coast had fallen behind on its debts for 2 years running, and a marriage to a wealthy duke who needed a wife skilled in managing his kitchens had seemed like the only door left open to her. She had described herself as capable because she needed to be capable. She had not expected him to test her on the very first night. "My lord, the journey delayed my ingredients," she said quickly. "Give me until tomorrow, and I will prepare a meal worthy of your table. I do not give second chances to people who waste my time," he said. "I gave instructions that my future duchess understand exactly what this household requires. A woman who can cook for her family in times of hardship, who does not rely on servants to hide her weaknesses. You claimed to be that woman. I am that woman," she said, lifting her chin even as her hands trembled behind her back. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel as though he could see straight through the flour on her sleeves and into every lie she had ever told. Then he turned without answering and walked toward the dining hall, leaving her standing alone in a kitchen filled with smoke and the wreckage of her first impression. She did not move until she heard a second set of footsteps. An older woman entered through the side door, her grey hair pulled back tightly, her eyes sharp with suspicion. This was Greta Bramwell, the head housekeeper, who had served the Marrowfield family for nearly 30 years and answered to no one but the Duke himself. "You burned the bread," Greta said, not as a question. "I know," Lenora answered. "He does not forgive burned bread," Greta said, folding her arms. "He does not forgive much of anything. You should know that, before you go further into this house." Lenora swallowed hard. Why does it matter so much to him? Surely a duke has cooks enough that his own wife need not labor over a stove. Greta's expression shifted, something old and painful crossing her face, before she shut it away again. "That is not your concern tonight. Tonight your concern is the soup, which I can already smell turning sour from here." Lenora rushed back to the stove, lifting the lid on the pot, to find the broth had separated, a thin layer of fat floating across the top. She had never learned to cook properly. Her family had always kept a cook of their own until the debts swallowed every coin they had, and by then it was too late to learn what she should have known years earlier. She stirred the pot desperately, trying to remember anything her old cook had once shown her, but panic made her hands clumsy, and the spoon slipped twice before she caught it again. A young maid named Phoebe Aldecott appeared at the doorway, her apron clean and pressed, her eyes wide with worry rather than judgment. She was younger than Lenora, perhaps no older than 17, and unlike Greta, she did not seem to carry any quiet resentment toward the new arrival. "The Duke is asking for the second course," Phoebe whispered. "He says if it is not ready in 10 minutes, he will assume you have nothing more to offer tonight." Lenora's stomach dropped. 10 minutes was not enough time to fix a broth that had already failed, and she had no second course prepared at all. She had spent the entire afternoon attempting to recreate a single dish from memory, certain that one good plate would be enough to buy her time. She had been wrong. "Tell him I need 15 minutes, she said, though she had no plan for what those 15 minutes would produce. "He does not wait 15 minutes for anything," Phoebe said gently. "Not since the steward returned late from the harvest count last autumn. He sent the man away that same week." The weight of that warning settled heavily in Lenora's chest. She was not dealing with a man who simply preferred punctuality. She was dealing with a man who treated every failure as proof that someone could not be trusted, and trust, it seemed, was the one thing he refused to extend twice. She poured the broth through a cloth, trying to salvage what she could, added what herbs she found scattered across the counter, and prayed the result would taste better than it looked. When Phoebe carried the bowl into the dining hall, Lenora stood by the kitchen door, straining to hear any sound from the other room. There was only silence, the kind that stretched far too long to mean anything good. When Phoebe returned, her face had gone pale. "He did not touch it," she said quietly. "He only asked one question." "What did he ask?" "He asked whether you intended to starve his entire household, or only him." Lenora stood very still after hearing those words, feeling something inside her crack just slightly, though she refused to let it show. She had faced disappointed faces before, from her father when the debts grew too large to hide, from neighbors who whispered behind closed doors about her family's decline. But there was something about this particular failure that struck deeper, perhaps because she had told herself this marriage was her chance to finally fix what her family had broken, and now that chance was crumbling in front of a man who clearly had no intention of giving her room to recover. She walked toward the dining hall herself, ignoring Greta's warning glance, and stopped at the entrance where the Duke sat alone at the long table, his untouched bowl pushed slightly to the side. "My lord," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I came here under the belief that you required a wife capable of managing your household with her own hands, and I admit tonight I have failed that requirement entirely. But I did not come here to lie to you. I came here because my family needed this marriage to survive, and I believed, perhaps foolishly, that skill could be learned faster than it actually can." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. though something flickered briefly behind his grey eyes, something that might have been surprising at her honesty, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Skill is learned through years, not desperation," he said. "I do not have years to wait for a wife who claims to already possess what she clearly does not." "Then teach me," she said, before she could stop herself. "Not because I expect kindness from you, but because I refuse to leave this house, having proven nothing but failure on my very first night." He rose from his chair slowly, walking toward her with measured steps that made her want to retreat, though she held her ground. Up close, he was even more imposing, his presence filling the room in a way that made the air feel thinner. "You misunderstand my household," he said. "I am not in the business of teaching grown women how to boil water. I require a wife who already understands what it means to provide, to sacrifice, to stand in a kitchen at dawn, because there is no one else to do it. My mother spent her final years doing exactly that, after my father's fortune nearly collapsed beneath bad investments, and she never once complained, never once pretended to be something she was not." For the first time, Lenora heard something beneath his coldness, a memory that clearly still weighed on him, though he buried it quickly beneath his usual sharpness. "I am not pretending," she said quietly. "I am trying. There is a difference, my lord, even if you refuse to see it tonight." He studied her again, longer this time, and for a brief moment, she wondered if something in her words had reached him. But then his expression hardened once more, and he stepped back, putting distance between them, as though her honesty had been an inconvenience rather than a revelation. "You have 1 week," he said finally. 1 week to prove you can manage this kitchen, as you claimed in your letter. If you fail, you will return to your family with whatever dignity you have left, and I will find a wife who does not require lessons in basic survival." 1 week, she repeated, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Starting tomorrow morning," he said. "Greta will show you the kitchen ledgers. You will learn what this household consumes, what it requires, and you will produce a meal worthy of this table by week's end, or you will leave Marrowfield entirely." He walked past her without another glance, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Lenora remained standing in the dining hall, staring at the empty bowl of broth that had cost her so much already, and she felt a strange mixture of fear and determination settle into her chest. Later that night, as she lay awake in the small guest chamber assigned to her, she heard a soft knock at her door. Phoebe entered carrying a single candle, her expression cautious. "I should not be here," Phoebe whispered, "but I wanted you to know something. The Duke was not always like this. Before his father's death, before the estate nearly fell apart, he used to laugh more. The servants still remember it, though none of us speak of it in front of him." She taught him that strength means never depending on anyone else's promises. I think when you wrote that letter, claiming skills you did not have, It reminded him of every promise that was broken to his family before. Lenora absorbed this slowly, understanding settling over her like a heavy blanket. His cruelty was not simply cruelty. It was armor, built from years of watching people fail his family when they needed reliability the most. That understanding did not erase the harshness of his words, but it gave her something new to hold on to, a reason to fight for this week, rather than surrender to it. "Will you help me?" Lenora asked Phoebe directly. "I cannot learn everything alone in 7 days." Phoebe glanced toward the door once more, then nodded slowly. "I am only a maid, but I have watched the old cook work for years before she passed. I can teach you what I know, though it will not be easy, and you must never tell the Duke I helped you." "I promise," Lenora said, gripping Phoebe's hand with sudden gratitude. As Phoebe slipped quietly back into the corridor, Lenora remained awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling above her narrow bed. Somewhere in this cold and disciplined house, beneath layers of harsh words and unyielding rules, there was a man shaped by loss rather than malice. She did not know yet whether understanding him would soften the path ahead, or simply make her failure feel heavier if it came. But one truth remained clear as she finally closed her eyes. She had 1 week to become someone she was not, and she intended to use every single hour of it. The morning arrived grey and damp, the kind of light that made the Marrowfield estate look older than it truly was, its stone walls darkened by years of rain and silence. Lenora woke before the sun had fully risen, dressing quickly in the small guest chamber before making her way down to the kitchen, determined not to waste a single hour of the week she had been given. She found Greta Bramwell already waiting for her, a thick leather ledger resting on the wooden table, her expression as unwelcoming as it had been the night before. "The Duke instructed me to teach you what this household requires," Greta said, opening the ledger to reveal pages of careful handwriting, listing supplies, costs, and the names of farms that delivered goods each week. "I will do as he asks, though I will not pretend I believe you are capable of finishing what you started." "Then let me prove you wrong," Lenora said, refusing to let the older woman's doubt settle into her chest the way it wanted to. Greta studied her for a long moment, something shifting slightly behind her stern expression, though she did not soften her tone. "This household feeds nearly 40 people each day, counting the staff, the stable hands, and anyone working the fields during harvest season. The Duke does not believe in waste, and he does not believe in excuses. You will need to understand every ingredient in this kitchen before you can call yourself capable of running it." For the next 2 hours, Greta walked her through the pantry, naming herbs Lenora had never used, explaining which meats required slow cooking and which spoiled quickly if left untouched. There were jars of preserved fruit stacked along one wall, sacks of grain in another corner, and a smoking room out back, where meats were cured through the winter months. Lenora absorbed everything she could, scribbling notes on a scrap of parchment, though her mind kept drifting back to the conversation from the previous night, the way the Duke's expression had hardened the moment she mentioned learning rather than already knowing. She wondered how many other women had stood in this same kitchen attempting to win his approval, only to leave defeated before the week even ended. As if summoned by her thoughts, a new voice entered the kitchen, sharp and confident in a way that immediately put Lenora on edge. "So this is the woman causing such a commotion below stairs," the voice said. Lenora turned to find a woman standing in the doorway, dressed plainly, but with an air of superiority that made the plainness feel deliberate rather than humble. Her name, Lenora would soon learn, was Agatha Pruitt, a distant cousin of the Duke who had been residing at Marrowfield for the past several months, claiming to assist with household matters while clearly harboring ambitions of her own. "I do not know what commotion you mean," Lenora said carefully. Agatha's smile did not reach her eyes. "The entire staff is whispering about the woman who burned bread on her very first night, then begged for a week to prove herself worthy of a duke's name. I find it rather entertaining, honestly. Marrowfield has not seen such drama in years. Greta's expression tightened, though she said nothing, clearly accustomed to staying silent around Agatha, despite whatever opinions she carried privately. Lenora felt a chill settle over her, sensing immediately that this woman represented more than simple curiosity. There was something calculating behind her smile, something that suggested she wanted Lenora to fail far more than she wanted to admit aloud. "If you will excuse us," Lenora said, turning back toward the pantry shelves. "Greta is teaching me what I need to know." "Of course," Agatha said smoothly, though she lingered in the doorway a moment longer, before finally retreating down the corridor, her footsteps unhurried, almost deliberate, as though she wanted Lenora to feel her absence as much as her presence. Once she was gone, Greta finally spoke, her voice lower than before. "Be careful with that one. She has wanted to secure her place in this household for a long time, and she does not take kindly to anyone who might threaten that position." "What position?" Lenora asked. "Well, I thought she was merely a distant cousin." Greta hesitated, glancing toward the doorway, as though making certain Agatha had truly left. She has hoped for years that the Duke might eventually marry her instead, securing her place here permanently, rather than relying on his charity. When word arrived that he intended to choose a wife through written correspondence, judging candidates solely on their claimed abilities rather than their birth or connections, Agatha was furious. She believes herself far more suited to this household than any stranger arriving with empty promises. Lenora absorbed this information slowly, understanding now why Agatha's smile had carried such sharp edges. She was not simply a curious cousin observing a scandal. She was a woman who had lost ground the moment Lenora stepped through the front door, and losing ground rarely encouraged kindness in people already inclined toward ambition. The following days passed in a blur of exhausting effort. Lenora woke before dawn each morning, practicing under Greta's careful instruction, learning how to properly season a stew, how to judge when bread had risen enough to bake, how to balance flavors without relying on guesswork alone. Phoebe Aldecott joined whenever her other duties allowed, offering quiet encouragement and small tricks she had learned from watching the previous cook for years before her passing. The old cook, Phoebe explained one afternoon, had served the family since before the Duke was born, and had taught Phoebe small things almost without meaning to. The way a kettle should sing rather than scream, the way dough should feel soft as a sleeping child rather than stiff as old leather. By the third day, Lenora had managed to produce a passable soup, though it lacked the depth of flavor that came naturally to someone with years of practice. She presented it nervously during the evening meal, standing just outside the dining hall as Phoebe carried the bowl inside. When Phoebe returned, her expression offered cautious relief rather than triumph. "He finished it," Phoebe whispered. "He did not say it was good, but he finished it, which is more than he did on the first night." Small as it seemed, Lenora felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a fragile thread of hope that perhaps this impossible task was not entirely beyond her reach. She continued practicing that night, long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, attempting a second dish, using techniques Greta had shown her earlier that day, determined to improve before the week's deadline arrived. The kitchen at night felt different from the kitchen during the day, quieter, gentler somehow, as though the walls themselves exhaled once the demands of the household had finally gone still. It was well past midnight when she heard footsteps approaching, heavier than Phoebe's light steps, more deliberate than Greta's familiar shuffle. She turned to find the Duke himself standing in the doorway, his coat removed, his sleeves rolled slightly, looking less like the imposing figure from the dining hall and more like a man who could not sleep either. "I could say the same of you, my lord," Lenora replied, before she could stop herself, immediately wondering if she had spoken too boldly. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his grey eyes. "I do not sleep well in this house. I have not slept well here for quite some time." "Why not?" she asked quietly, sensing an opening she had not expected to find. He hesitated, clearly debating whether to answer at all, before finally speaking in a voice quieter than she had heard from him before. "This kitchen was my mother's domain, long before it became a battleground for desperate brides seeking to prove themselves. She used to work here long after the rest of the household slept, determined to keep this family fed, even as our fortune crumbled around us. I used to sit right there," he said, gesturing toward a small stool tucked beneath the work table, watching her hands move faster than anyone else's, never complaining, never once admitting how exhausted she truly was. Lenora glanced toward the stool, trying to imagine a younger version of this hardened man sitting quietly while his mother fought to hold their world together. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he said simply. "She died believing her sacrifice had saved this family, and in many ways it did. But it also taught me that strength and exhaustion often look identical from the outside, and I have spent years refusing to let anyone else carry that same burden without first proving they understood its weight." For the first time since her arrival, Lenora saw something beyond cruelty in his expression. She saw grief, carefully buried beneath years of discipline, emerging now only because exhaustion had worn down whatever walls he normally kept firmly in place. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not know." "Few people do," he said, "and I prefer it that way." He turned to leave, though he paused at the doorway, glancing back at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. The soup tonight was edible. Tomorrow, try adding thyme, rather than relying solely on salt.
My mother always said thyme could rescue almost any dish that lacked depth.
Before she could respond, he disappeared down the corridor, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen once more, though this time the silence felt different, less like punishment and more like something fragile, beginning to grow between them, despite every reason it should not. She stood there for a long while, turning his words over in her mind, wondering how a man so guarded could still carry his mother's memory so tenderly beneath all that armor, and wondering, too, why his trust in her felt more dangerous to her heart than his earlier coldness ever had. The fourth day began with renewed determination, Lenora rising even earlier than before, eager to apply the advice the Duke had offered the previous night. She found thyme exactly where Greta had shown her days earlier, carefully measuring it into the simmering pot, watching the aroma shift into something richer than anything she had produced thus far. When Phoebe tasted a small spoonful, her eyes widened with genuine surprise. "This is good," Phoebe said. "Truly good, not simply edible." Lenora felt pride swell in her chest, though she quickly reminded herself that one improved dish did not guarantee success when the full week's judgment arrived. She continued practicing throughout the day, determined to master not just one recipe but several, understanding that consistency mattered more than a single lucky attempt. She baked bread twice that morning, discarding the first loaf when it rose unevenly, before producing a second loaf with a crust that crackled softly when she pressed her thumb against it. As afternoon approached, Agatha appeared once more, her presence as unwelcome as before, though this time she carried herself with even greater confidence, as though she had learned something that pleased her significantly.
"I heard the Duke visited the kitchen rather late last night,"
Agatha said, leaning against the doorway with deliberate casualness. How interesting that he would spend his sleepless hours offering cooking advice to a woman who lied her way into this household. You should be careful, dear girl. The Duke has a tendency to show brief kindness to women he ultimately discards. I would know. I have watched it happen more than once. What do you mean? Lenora asked, unable to stop herself, despite knowing Agatha likely wanted exactly this reaction. Agatha's eyes glittered with something close to satisfaction. Did Greta not mention the woman who came before you? Another bride, chosen through the same correspondence system, who arrived nearly 8 months ago, believing herself capable of meeting his impossible standards. She lasted nearly a month before he sent her away, declaring her efforts insufficient, despite everything she sacrificed trying to please him. Lenora felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she refused to let Agatha see how deeply the words affected her. Why would you tell me this? Because someone should warn you, before you waste your heart on a man who measures worth through impossible standards, Agatha said, though her tone carried less concern than calculation. Unless, of course, you would rather hear it from me now than discover it yourself later, once it becomes far more difficult to walk away. She left without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with the same deliberate confidence as before. Lenora remained standing in the kitchen, her thoughts spinning rapidly, uncertain whether Agatha's warning carried any truth or simply existed to plant doubt deep enough to ensure Lenora's failure. She tried to push the conversation from her mind as she returned to her work, but the doubt lingered anyway, settling into the corners of her thoughts, the way smoke settles into fabric long after the flame has gone out. She thought of her family back home, of her younger brother who still believed she had traveled to Marrowfield for a grand adventure rather than a desperate gamble, and she wondered whether she was protecting them or simply delaying their disappointment. That evening, as she prepared the dish she hoped would finally impress the household during dinner, Phoebe entered carrying fresh linens, her expression troubled. "You should not listen to everything Agatha says," Phoebe said quietly, as though sensing exactly what conversation had transpired earlier. "She twists truth into whatever shape benefits her most." "Was there truly another bride before me?" Lenora asked directly. Phoebe hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and honesty. "There was a woman, yes, though the situation was not quite as Agatha described it. She did not fail because her cooking lacked skill. She failed because she never truly wanted this marriage at all. She came seeking the Duke's wealth alone, with no genuine intention of fulfilling her promises, and once he discovered her true motives, he ended the arrangement immediately." "Because she wants you to doubt him," Phoebe said. "She wants you to believe kindness from him is temporary, a trick rather than truth, so that you abandon this challenge before it threatens her own hopes of someday taking your place." Lenora absorbed this slowly, anger beginning to replace her earlier uncertainty. She had not traveled this far, sacrificed this much, only to be manipulated by a woman whose ambitions depended entirely on Lenora's failure. She returned to her cooking with renewed focus, determined to prove herself not for Agatha's benefit, nor even entirely for the Duke's approval, but for her own sake. refusing to let manipulation dictate the outcome of this challenge. The dinner that evening proved to be her finest attempt yet. The thyme-infused stew, accompanied by freshly baked bread that rose perfectly under her careful attention. She added a small dish of stewed pears on the side, something she remembered her own mother preparing during better years, sweetened lightly with honey from the estate's own hives. When Phoebe carried the dishes into the dining hall, Lenora waited anxiously outside, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Several minutes passed before Phoebe returned, though this time her expression carried something Lenora had not seen before, genuine excitement, rather than cautious relief. "He asked who prepared this," Phoebe said breathlessly. "He asked specifically, wanting to know whether you had assistance or whether this truly came from your own hands. What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," Phoebe said, "that you prepared every dish yourself, though I taught you certain techniques along the way." Lenora's stomach tightened with uncertainty. "Was he angry that you helped me?" Phoebe shook her head slowly. "He did not seem angry at all. In fact, I believe he seemed almost pleased, though he tried rather hard to hide it." That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Lenora wandered into the garden behind the kitchen, needing fresh air after the tension of the day. The garden had clearly once been tended with great care, though now only a few hardy plants remained, growing wild around an old stone fountain that no longer held water. She found the Duke already there, standing near the fountain, his expression distant as he stared up at the darkened sky. "You did well tonight," he said, without turning, apparently having heard her approach. "Thank you, my lord," she said, stepping closer despite her nervousness. "Though I suspect Agatha would prefer I had failed entirely." His jaw tightened slightly at the mention of her name. "Agatha has her own reasons for wanting this household to remain exactly as it has always been. She fears change because change threatens the position she has carved for herself here, however precarious that position truly is. She told me about another woman," Lenora said carefully, "before me." He turned to face her fully now, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "What exactly did she tell you? That you discarded a woman after she failed to meet your standards, despite her sacrifices to please you?" His expression hardened, though not toward her, she realized, but toward the memory itself. "That woman never intended to honor our arrangement. She sought my title and my wealth, nothing more. And the moment I discovered her true intentions, I ended the arrangement before it could cause greater harm to either of us. Agatha knows this truth, yet she chooses to twist it whenever it serves her purposes." "Why does she resent me so deeply?" Lenora asked. "I have done nothing to threaten her position, beyond simply existing within this household." "Because your existence reminds her that she has waited years for something I never intended to offer her," he said simply. "She believes herself entitled to this house, to this title, despite the fact that I have never once given her reason to believe such things were possible." Lenora studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, though she found none. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve honesty," he said, "even if I have not always offered it freely since your arrival." They stood together in silence for several long moments, the cool night air settling around them as something unspoken passed between them, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniably present. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, an owl called once, then fell silent again, and neither of them moved to break the stillness that followed. For the first time since stepping through his front door days earlier, Lenora felt as though she was beginning to see the man beneath the Duke. And despite every warning Agatha had offered, she found herself unwilling to look away. The fifth day brought with it a storm that rolled over the hills surrounding Marrowfield, dark clouds pressing low against the horizon, as though the sky itself sensed the tension building within the estate. Lenora woke to the sound of distant thunder, the air thick and heavy, in a way that made even simple tasks feel more difficult than usual. 2 days remained before the Duke would deliver his final judgment, and she intended to spend every remaining hour ensuring nothing could be left to chance. She arrived in the kitchen to find Greta already waiting. Though something in the older woman's posture seemed different that morning, less guarded than before. "You have improved more than I expected," Greta admitted, though her tone remained practical rather than warm. "The Duke mentioned your bread again this morning, comparing it favorably to dishes prepared during his mother's time. That is no small praise, considering how rarely he speaks of her at all." Lenora felt a flicker of pride at the words, though she quickly tempered it, aware that 2 days remained more than enough time for everything to collapse beneath fresh disaster. "I still have so much to learn. The roasted meats remain a struggle, and I fear the final dinner will require something beyond what I have managed so far." "Then we shall practice the roasted meats today," Greta said simply, already moving toward the larder, where a fresh cut of venison awaited preparation, delivered that morning from one of the estate's tenant farms. They worked through the morning together, Greta demonstrating how to properly season the meat, how to judge the fire's heat without burning the outer layer before the inside finished cooking. Lenora absorbed every instruction carefully, though her concentration wavered slightly each time her thoughts drifted toward the previous night's conversation in the garden, toward the unexpected vulnerability the Duke had revealed beneath the stars. By midday, the storm outside had worsened considerably, rain lashing against the kitchen windows with enough force that Phoebe had to light extra candles simply to see properly across the room. It was during this chaos that disaster struck, though not from the kitchen itself. A young stable boy burst through the side door, his clothes soaked through, his face pale with alarm. "The East Bridge has collapsed," he shouted, struggling to catch his breath. Lady Pruitt was crossing toward the tenant cottages when the flooding swept through. "She is trapped on the riverbank, and the water continues rising." The kitchen fell into immediate chaos, Greta calling for assistance, while Phoebe rushed to alert the rest of the household. Agatha rarely ventured toward the tenant cottages, and the timing of her crossing during such severe weather struck Lenora as oddly convenient, almost deliberate, though she pushed the suspicion aside, knowing a woman's life mattered more than her own unease. Within minutes, the Duke himself appeared, already dressed for the storm, his expression sharp with urgency as he called for ropes and lanterns. Several of the male staff gathered quickly, though the distance to the riverbank required crossing terrain already slick with mud and debris from the collapsed bridge. "I am coming as well," Lenora said suddenly, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. The Duke turned to her sharply. "This is no place for you. The riverbank will be dangerous, and I cannot spare attention to ensure your safety while also managing the rescue itself." "Then I will manage my own safety," she said, refusing to back down despite the storm raging outside. "Agatha may resent me, but I will not stand idle while her life remains at risk." He studied her for a brief moment, something unreadable passing through his expression, before finally nodding once. "Stay close to Greta, and do exactly as instructed. I will not lose another life to this estate's carelessness." The journey toward the riverbank proved more treacherous than Lenora had anticipated, the ground shifting beneath her boots with every step, rain stinging her eyes despite the hood pulled tightly around her face. When they finally reached the collapsed bridge, she saw Agatha clinging desperately to a half-submerged log, the river churning violently around her, threatening to pull her under at any moment. The Duke moved immediately, securing a rope around his waist, before wading into the rushing water himself, ignoring the protests of the staff, who begged him to wait for additional support. Lenora watched with her heart in her throat as he fought against the current, the water rising past his knees, then his waist, the force of it nearly knocking him backward more than once. "Hold on!" he shouted toward Agatha, his voice barely audible above the roaring water. "I am almost there." Agatha's grip on the log slipped slightly, panic flashing across her face as the water surged higher. For a moment, Lenora feared the worst, watching helplessly from the bank as the Duke pushed forward, finally reaching close enough to grasp Agatha's outstretched hand. He pulled her toward him with considerable effort, the current fighting against every movement, before finally guiding her back toward the staff, waiting along the bank with additional rope. When they finally reached solid ground, Agatha collapsed against the muddy earth, coughing violently as Greta rushed forward with blankets. The Duke remained kneeling beside her for a moment, ensuring she was breathing steadily, before rising to his feet, his clothes soaked through, his expression exhausted but resolute. It was only later, once everyone had returned to the estate, and Agatha had been settled into her chamber, under Greta's careful supervision, that something about the entire incident began to trouble Lenora deeply. She found Phoebe in the kitchen that evening, both of them attempting to process the chaos of the day. Why was Agatha crossing toward the tenant cottages during such terrible weather? Lenora asked quietly. She has never shown interest in visiting the tenants before. Phoebe's expression grew troubled. I wondered the same thing. One of the stable hands mentioned she requested a horse earlier that morning, claiming urgent business, though no one seems to know what business required crossing that particular bridge during a storm. Do you think she meant to be there at all? Lenora asked carefully. Or could something else have happened? Phoebe hesitated, lowering her voice further. I do not wish to spread rumors, but one of the younger maids mentioned seeing Agatha near the bridge earlier that week, examining the wooden supports rather closely, for someone with no reason to concern herself with estate maintenance. The implications settled heavily between them, though neither woman spoke it aloud directly. Could Agatha have weakened the bridge deliberately, perhaps intending for Lenora to be the one summoned toward danger, only for her own plan to backfire when the structure collapsed sooner than anticipated? The thought seemed almost too cruel to consider, yet Agatha's resentment had already proven itself capable of cunning manipulation through her earlier lies about the previous bride. Lenora pushed the suspicion aside for the moment, focusing instead on the final dinner that loomed only one day away. She spent that evening preparing everything she could in advance, determined to present a meal worthy of ending this challenge with success rather than failure. The kitchen remained quiet around her, the storm finally beginning to ease outside, though her thoughts remained anything but calm. It was nearly midnight when the Duke appeared once more, his clothes changed from the soaked garments he had worn earlier, though exhaustion remained evident in the slight slump of his shoulders. You should be resting, she said softly, noting the weariness etched across his face. I find myself drawn to this kitchen rather often these days, he admitted, a faint trace of something gentler than his usual sternness coloring his voice. You saved her life today, Lenora said. Whatever resentment exists between you and Agatha, you did not hesitate when it mattered most. I could not stand by and watch anyone drown, regardless of the difficulties between us, he said simply. Though I confess, Watching you insist on joining the rescue, rather than remaining safely behind, concerned me more than I expected. I could not stand idle either, she said. Not when someone's life depended on action, rather than hesitation. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his grey eyes, softer than she had seen before. You continue to surprise me, Lenora. I expected a woman who lied about her abilities to crumble beneath pressure, yet you have done nothing but rise toward every challenge placed before you. Hearing her name spoken by him for the first time, rather than the formal distance he typically maintained, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Perhaps I am not entirely the woman who arrived through that door days ago. Perhaps none of us remain entirely the same person we were before circumstances tested us, he said quietly. He reached toward her then, his hand hovering uncertainly for a moment, before finally taking hers gently, his fingers calloused from years of estate work, yet his touch remarkably careful, as though she were something fragile, despite everything she had proven about her own strength. Neither of them spoke for several long moments, the simple connection between their hands carrying more weight than any words could have offered. "Tomorrow's dinner will determine everything," she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow's dinner will determine far less than you believe," he said, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "I have already seen enough of your character these past days to understand exactly what kind of woman stands before me, regardless of how skillfully you manage a roasted dish." Before she could respond, a sudden crash echoed from the pantry, startling them both apart. Lenora rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding, to find a shelf had collapsed, scattering jars and supplies across the floor. Yet upon closer inspection, the support beam beneath the shelf appeared cleanly cut, rather than naturally broken, the edges far too smooth and deliberate to suggest simple wear or accident. The Duke knelt beside her, examining the damage with a frown deepening across his face. "This was no accident," he said grimly. "Someone deliberately weakened this shelf, knowing it would collapse during use." Lenora felt a chill spread through her chest, the earlier suspicion about the bridge returning with renewed urgency. "Do you think this connects to what happened at the river today?" His expression hardened with sudden understanding. "I think someone within this household has grown desperate enough to risk genuine harm, rather than simply spreading rumors and doubt. And I intend to discover exactly who that person is before this matter goes any further." The following morning arrived with unusual stillness, the storm having passed entirely, leaving behind clear skies that seemed almost mocking against the tension gripping the estate. Lenora woke early, her mind still troubled by the collapsed shelf and its implications, though she forced herself to focus on the final preparations required for that evening's crucial dinner. The Duke had spent the early hours questioning members of the household staff, attempting to determine who might have access to the pantry during the hours when the sabotage likely occurred. Greta reported that nothing definitive had emerged, though suspicion clearly lingered around Agatha, despite her recent brush with danger at the riverbank. It seems strange that she would endanger herself merely to cast suspicion elsewhere, Greta admitted during a quiet moment in the kitchen. Though stranger things have happened when desperation overtakes reason entirely. Lenora continued her preparations throughout the day, determined not to let fear distract her from the task ahead. She prepared the roasted venison exactly as Greta had taught her, accompanied by fresh bread and a delicate sauce flavored with herbs from the estate's own garden. Phoebe assisted wherever possible, though tension remained evident in her movements, both women aware that danger might still lurk somewhere within the household's shadows. It was during the final hour before dinner, while Lenora stood alone checking the roasting meat one final time, that she noticed something peculiar about the wine decanter set aside for the evening meal. A faint residue clung to the rim, unlike anything she had seen during her days of training under Greta's careful instruction. She called for Phoebe immediately, who examined the decanter with a growing alarm. "This does not look right at all. Someone may have tampered with this wine." Before either woman could investigate further, Agatha appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully composed, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes upon seeing the decanter in Lenora's hands. "Whatever are you doing with that?" Agatha asked, her voice carrying forced casualness. "Examining it," Lenora said carefully, watching Agatha's reaction closely. "There appears to be something unusual about this wine." Agatha's composure slipped slightly, just enough for Lenora to notice genuine alarm beneath her careful mask. "I am certain it is nothing of concern. Perhaps simply sediment from the bottle's aging." "Perhaps," Lenora said, though her instincts told her otherwise. She set the decanter aside, deciding the safest course involved preparing fresh wine entirely, rather than risking whatever Agatha's nervous reaction might indicate. As she turned to retrieve a new bottle from the cellar, she caught sight of Agatha's expression shifting from alarm into something colder, more calculating, as though realizing her plan had been discovered before it could unfold. When the Duke arrived for dinner that evening, Lenora found herself watching Agatha closely throughout the meal, noting how the woman's attention remained fixed on every dish served, particularly the wine that Lenora had deliberately replaced, without announcing the substitution to anyone beyond Phoebe and Greta. The meal proceeded smoothly, the Duke offering quiet praise for the venison's preparation, the bread's perfect texture, and the subtle balance of herbs throughout each course. Yet Lenora remained alert, sensing that the danger from the previous night's sabotage had not fully passed, regardless of how peaceful the evening appeared on its surface. It was near the meal's conclusion when Agatha rose suddenly from her seat, her expression strained. "I find myself feeling unwell," she announced, though something about her tone suggested calculation rather than genuine illness. "Perhaps you should rest," the Duke said, though his eyes carried suspicion rather than concern. Agatha moved toward the door, though as she passed close to where the original wine decanter still sat untouched on a side table, she reached for it suddenly, attempting to remove it from the room entirely. Lenora rose quickly, intercepting her before she could leave with the evidence. "Leave that where it belongs," Lenora said firmly. "This is none of your concern," Agatha snapped, her careful mask finally crumbling entirely. The Duke stood immediately, his expression hardening into something Lenora had not witnessed before. Cold fury barely contained beneath rigid control. "What exactly is happening here?" "She tampered with the wine," Lenora said, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "I noticed it earlier, and replaced it before dinner began. I believe she intended for someone to fall seriously ill tonight, perhaps hoping suspicion would fall upon my cooking, rather than her own actions." Agatha's expression twisted with desperation as she realized her scheme had unraveled completely. "You cannot prove anything," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I can prove the bridge support was weakened deliberately," the Duke said, his voice deadly quiet. "I can prove the pantry shelf was cut rather than broken naturally. And now, I can prove tampered wine sits upon my table, mere hours after you yourself nearly drowned, attempting to direct suspicion away from your own schemes. Everything I did because this household belongs to me by right," Agatha said, her composure shattering entirely now. "I have given years of my life to this family, watching, waiting, hoping you would eventually see reason and choose someone who truly understands this estate's legacy, rather than some stranger who arrived through a letter, claiming false skills to secure a title she never deserved. You attempted to harm her," the Duke said, gesturing toward Lenora. "Whatever resentment you carry toward circumstances beyond your control, nothing justifies endangering another person's life through deliberate sabotage." Agatha's eyes filled with furious tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simple frustration at being discovered remained unclear. "I never intended for anyone to drown. I merely wished to create enough chaos that her failures would become impossible to ignore, that you would finally see her as unworthy and turn your attention back towards someone who has waited far longer for your recognition." Your actions nearly cost a life, the Duke said firmly. I cannot allow you to remain within this household after such reckless disregard for safety, regardless of whatever history exists between our families. The confrontation ended with Agatha being escorted from the estate that same night, her belongings hastily gathered under Greta's stern supervision, her protests fading into the darkness as the carriage carried her away from Marrowfield permanently. The household settled into uneasy quiet afterward, though relief gradually replaced the earlier tension as everyone began processing exactly how close disaster had come to unfolding. Later that evening, once the chaos had finally settled, Lenora found herself once again in the garden behind the kitchen, the same fountain standing silent beside her as she attempted to calm her racing thoughts. The Duke joined her shortly after, his expression softer than she had ever witnessed, exhaustion mixing with something that looked remarkably like relief. You saved more than just yourself tonight, he said quietly. Had that wine reached the table unnoticed, the consequences could have proven far more severe than anyone anticipated. I simply noticed something that felt wrong, she said. Anyone paying close enough attention might have done the same. Not everyone pays such close attention, he said, stepping closer. Not everyone would have insisted on joining a dangerous rescue, nor noticed tampered wine before disaster struck, nor faced an entire week of impossible standards, without once abandoning the challenge entirely. He reached for her hand again, this time without hesitation, his fingers intertwining gently with hers, as he studied her face in the moonlight. I set this challenge believing I needed a wife who already possessed every skill my mother once carried. I see now that skill alone never mattered as much as character, as courage, as the willingness to keep trying, even when failure seemed certain. Does that mean I have proven myself, my lord? She asked softly, hardly daring to hope. You proved yourself the moment you refused to let Agatha's manipulation determine your worth, he said. Everything since then has simply confirmed what I already suspected. You are exactly the woman this household needs. Not because you cook flawlessly, though you have improved remarkably, but because you face every challenge with honesty and courage, rather than retreat. He lifted her hand gently, pressing the back of it softly, without crossing into anything beyond simple tenderness, his eyes never leaving hers. Would you allow me to court you properly now, Lenora? Not through a hastily arranged challenge born from desperation, but through genuine intention, allowing whatever exists between us to grow naturally, rather than being tested through impossible standards alone. Tears gathered in her eyes, though they carried only relief and quiet joy, rather than the fear that had accompanied her throughout the past week. I would like that very much, my lord. Theodric, he said softly. My name is Theodric. I believe it is time you used it, considering everything we have endured together this past week. Theodric, she repeated, the name feeling oddly natural, despite everything that had unfolded since her arrival. They remained together in the quiet garden for a long while afterward, the moonlight casting gentle shadows around them, the estate finally settling into peaceful stillness after days of chaos and uncertainty. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the months ahead, whatever whispers might continue throughout the household regarding her unconventional path toward this position, Lenora understood now that she had found something far more valuable than simple approval. She had found a man willing to see her honestly, flaws and courage alike, and a household finally beginning to feel like the home she had never quite believed she deserved.